College convocation series. We're acquainted with a distinguished individual who has joined our faculty as a visiting professor this term. He is director of the American Swedish Institute in Minneapolis, and he brings with him a wealth of experience. He took his undergraduate work at North Park College, Chicago, Illinois, his master and PhD degree from the University of Chicago, and his professional experience includes teaching at the University of Chicago, working for the Department of State and the U.S. Information Agency, and he has also served as political counselor at the American Embassy in Oslo, Norway. Now, he recently has been informed that he will receive an honorary PhD from the University of Uppsala at the end of May, and we want to join in adding our congratulations to him for this honor. It's my privilege then to introduce Dr. Nils William Olsson, who will speak to us on the topic Scandinavia Today.
Thank you, Dr. Chrislock, Dr. Anderson, fellow faculty members and students. In sharing this 1st of May with you today, I'm grateful for two things. After flitting about the globe for more than 2 decades, it is with a feeling of stability and a sense of being rooted once more that I am happy to be united again with the college campus. Another facet of my pleasure of being here today is the fact that your observance of May Day, or as you call it, My Fest, takes me back to my own college days in North Park in Chicago, where I attended some 4 decades ago, long before most of you were born. North Park College, itself cherishing a heritage based upon Swedish beginnings, celebrated May Day as naturally as you people are focusing on your My Fest. The geographical locale of North Park is still the same, but where we frolicked 40 years ago in reckless abandon at the end of Foster Avenue, where the thoroughfare ended and woods began, today a motor expressway thunders by. May Day at North Park is now history, but those of us who were part of this Swedish tradition can still remember how we saluted the dawn with the singing of Sköna maj, välkommen till vår bygd igen. Sköna maj, välkommen, våra lekars vän. Känslans gudaflamma väcktes vid din ljusning. Jord och skyar stamma, kärlek och förtjusning. Sorgen into our midst. Thereupon we walked 4 blocks up one of the Chicago streets to serenade our favorite professor, the philosopher David Nyvall, who at one time had been a student at Uppsala University. For him we sang Sjung om studentens lyckliga dag, låt oss fröjdas I ungdomens vår. En klappar hjärtat med friska slag, och den ljusnande framtid är vår. Let us sing about the happy days from student life. Let us once more remember the springtime of our youth. As we finished our song, a tousled, silvery white head popped out behind the curtain and shouted, "Hurrah!" We felt well repaid for our early morning walk, and we also sense that we have started our May Day in the right manner. Only if you have lived in Scandinavia can you understand what the coming of spring means to the average citizen. The winters may not be as severe as here in Minnesota, but they are interminably long and sometimes dreary with little, if any, sun. I still remember a December in Stockholm some years ago when officially there was not one single hour of sunshine recorded for the entire month for the city. No wonder people by the thousands and tens of thousands turn their faces to the sun as it begins to rise higher on the northern heavens at this season of the year. I congratulate you on keeping alive this rite of spring, maybe not as necessary to us as to our cousins across the water, but nevertheless a reminder of their way of life, their customs, and their beliefs. I've been asked to speak to you today on the topic of Scandinavia Today, a subject which could consume not only the time allotted for this convocation, but many more hours. And yet it would not be possible to really define what is really meant by such a complex subject. Instead, I should like to present you with a thumbnail sketch of what has united the Scandinavians and perhaps underline the example which they offer to the world today. I have been fortunate enough to have been allowed spending a considerable time in this part of the world. 2 wonderful years in Iceland, almost 5 very rewarding years in Norway, and 7 action-packed years in Sweden. Though never posted to Denmark or Finland, I've had the privilege of visiting these nations often, and through a number of friends there, I have been able to gain a valuable insight into these nations and their way of life. During my 5 years of service in Washington, I had the good fortune to spend most of that time as public affairs advisor to the office in the Department of State dealing with the 5 Scandinavian countries, which thus gave me a further opportunity to cultivate frequent contacts with the 5 Scandinavian embassies which happen to be in that city. These many years have thus afforded me the rare opportunity of studying the Scandinavian North and to learn to know, even if only in part, what makes these nations unique in the world order. I think that we readily admit that in today's topsy-turvy world, in which confrontations between ideologies, social systems, and national aspirations have spawned reams of newspaper reports, the Scandinavians have remained a very quiescent and calm corner of the world. This does not mean that by comparison with the turbulence of the rest of the world that the North has been a stagnant lagoon. Far from it. There is life, there is activity, and a penchant for doing something in the Scandinavian countries, even if those who dream of social progress and human justice sometimes are drowned out by the noisemakers. The Scandinavian countries give us a reason to pause, to study and perhaps analyze the forces which, interacting so near the Arctic Circle, have brought about a stability astounding to the social scientists and welcome to the average citizen. Several historians and social commentators have attempted to analyze this phenomenon. Most have not agreed. And it is no wonder, for in trying to analyze this 5-power constellation, one is struck by more differences than similarities, and certainly by a number of paradoxes. Some ascribe Scandinavian unity to the similarity of language, and yet it is a known fact that though 4 of the countries speak language with a strong kinship to each other, the 5th country, Finland, speaks a language so different and so difficult that it has nothing in common whatsoever with the other Scandinavian tongues, except perhaps for a few and scattered loanwords. Even though we historically view the other 4 Scandinavian languages as being related, and indeed 1,000 years ago we are told that all Norse peoples spoke the same language, whether they lived in Iceland, Denmark, Norway, or Sweden. or whether they, as Vikings, ravaged the shores along the Seine, or sojourned in Constantinople, in Normandy, in Dublin, or in Novgorod, or hibernated on the clammy coasts of Greenland. Today the situation is quite different. Instead of drawing together, the Scandinavian languages are drawing farther apart. Icelandic is not generally understood by the Swede, by the Norwegian, or Dane. In fact, an Icelander must learn Danish in his elementary school if he hopes to communicate with his Scandinavian brethren in a Scandinavian language. In Norway, 100 years ago or so, rebellious elements within the university began turning against the Dano-Norwegian language, common to both Denmark and Norway, and began constructing a new Norwegian language, landsmål, nynorsk today, built upon several peasant dialects extant in the Norwegian valleys, and thereby created a schism between two competing languages, the riksmål and the nynorsk, which today is deeper than ever, and which has created language problems, probably not as severe, but certainly akin to those in Belgium, in Ireland, and in Finland. I never dreamed in my university days that someday I would be sitting in Oslo looking at an Ibsen play translated from the original Dano-Norwegian into nynorsk and presented by one of the leading theaters in the country. No, I think we can discount to a large degree the notion that a common language is basic to Scandinavian unity. Some historians will tell us that Scandinavian harmony today is based upon a common history, common ideals, common customs, and even a common religion. Important as these factors are, I believe we are on safe ground if we conclude that historical similarities are not enough. Actually, if we probe with the historians, we are more likely to find that the past, replete with problems, strife, and suspicion, scarcely the basis upon which to found an enduring peace and concord. We need only be reminded of the fact that from 1284 to 1944, Iceland was under the hegemony of Norway first, and then Denmark. That from the time of the Reformation until 1814, Norway was under Danish rule, and that in the latter year, Norway was handed over to Sweden as a consolation prize by the great powers to soothe the Swedes for their loss of Finland. Finland itself, tied to Sweden by common bonds from time immemorial until 1809, and until that year an integral part of that country was lost to Russia, becoming a grand duchy in the Russian orbit until 1918. Sweden and Denmark, hereditary enemies for centuries, did not actually grow up as nations until the Napoleonic Wars were over. No two countries in Europe, I dare say, have such a long history of wars, treachery, and tension as these two nations bordering upon the Öresund. Despite the turbulent tread of history, the Scandinavian countries in the 20th century have been able to forget the past in order to concentrate on the future. I believe, therefore, that we should look elsewhere for the elixir of life which has enabled the 5 Scandinavian countries to develop a unique relationship for our time. I would call your attention to a factor often overlooked, but which I believe to be a causal factor linking the 5 together. It is a word, or words, if you please, often banal sounding and frequently overworked, and yet I think they are true for the Scandinavian area. The words are democracy and freedom. I believe that if one looks very closely at all 5 Scandinavian peoples and their progress across the centuries, there is a definite and recognizable red thread which runs through their variegated histories. The red thread of a true and vital spirit of democracy and a love of freedom, both personal and national, which has remained alive and which, like the Olympic torch, has been handed down from individual to individual. True, there are times when that flame has flickered, but it never died out. And today that spirit, it seems to me, is stronger than ever before. I don't wish to bore you with historical details, but I need only remind you that the oldest parliament in the world, the Icelandic Althing, which as early as 930 A.D. met at Thingvellir to conduct its business of governing in a most democratic manner, so democratic, in fact, that the system provided for no executive branch of government. Thus, in the following centuries, chaos and confusion took over, and Iceland ceased to exist as a free and independent nation and slipped into the orbit of the powerful Norwegian kings. The love of freedom remained, however, and blossomed forth in all its freshness in the 19th century in the person of Jon Sigurdsson, whose struggle for Icelandic independence culminated in the breaking of the final tie with Denmark on June 17, 1944. In Sweden, the love of freedom and democracy has had a long and honorable history, going back to the days of Engelbrekt, Sture, and Bishop Thomas, whose song to freedom in the 17th century inspired Swedes to seek liberty, since, according to Bishop Thomas, freedom was in fact the highest good on earth. In Norway, the spirit of democracy and love of freedom broke out in full flame on May 17, 1814, when at Eidsvoll, outside of Oslo, farmers, artisans, and industrialists framed the new Norwegian Constitution, today the most prized document in the Norwegian National Archives. At Mora Stenar, the Finns declared their freedom, and this historic event inspires and enthuses every Finn even today. This spirit was able to break the onslaught of Russian pan-Slavism of the early part of our century, when Russian nationalists sought to replace Finnish and Swedish with the Russian language, even in the Finnish legislative chambers. Finally, in Denmark, it was Nicholas Frederick Severin Grundtvig who in the middle of the 19th century shook the Danes out of their lethargy as the forces from the south pecked away at the southern borders. He preached democracy and love of freedom, which developed into the famous folk high school movement, of import not only to Denmark in a very trying period, but also subsequently a great blessing even to other Scandinavian countries. I mention these isolated instances as examples of how the small Scandinavian countries from time immemorial have harbored within themselves this spirit of freedom, and which in the last 50 years has inspired these 5 nations to work together rather than compete, or even worse, unsheath their swords in fratricide. Here should be mentioned the peaceful dissolution of the Swedish-Norwegian condominium in 1905, without a shot being fired. The acceptance by Sweden of the decision of the World Court in 1921 that the Åland Islands in the Baltic remain with Finland, despite the fact that the islanders overwhelmingly had voted for annexation by Sweden. The refusal of Denmark to annex South Schleswig after 1918, when Germany was on its knees, knowing that by absorbing a large German minority within its borders, despite historical rights to the area, Denmark only would be adding to its future headaches. Later, the Norwegians accepted the World Court's decision that certain disputed enclaves on the east side of Greenland be given Danish sovereignty. Any one of these incidents, had they happened in other parts of the world, could easily have triggered a minor war or even a greater conflagration. During the 19th century, Pan-Scandinavianism developed at the various Scandinavian centers of learning, when emotion-laden students pledged eternal brotherhood at their festivals and jamborees. This spirit was not strong enough to inspire politicians, however, and when Prussia invaded Denmark in 1864, both the Swedish and the Norwegian governments refused to go to Denmark's aid. Scandinavianism, as an emotion-packed phenomenon, had fizzled out. It was not until shortly after World War I had begun that the Scandinavians thought seriously about banding themselves together True, it was the common danger of being attacked or being pulled into the vortex of the war which drew them together. But the economic coexistence and the mutual aid which they could afford each other gave them all an insight into what could be accomplished when peace came. One of the most influential groups in the increased cooperation among the Scandinavian nations was the society Norden, which through its 500 chapters and its membership of 120,000 of the cultured elite of the North contributed not a little to keep cooperation current. Though mostly cultural in its emphasis, it was to be proved that this approach was to be far more productive than if the 5 countries had attempted something in the realm of politics or economics. One of the important contributions of the Northern Society was its successful work of revising the textbooks used in the public schools. Old, hackneyed, and ultra-nationalist cliches were removed and corrected. Christian the Tyrant, the Danish king, responsible for the bloodbath of Stockholm in 1520, and about whom I had read with righteous indignation in the Swedish elementary schools as a child, is now referred to by his right name, Christian II, a truly great Danish king whose sole responsibility for ordering the beheading of more than 80 Swedish nobles in 1520 is seriously questioned by a number of historians. Following in the footsteps of the Northern Society have been a number of cooperative Nordic groupings in all fields of human endeavor, notably the Interparliamentary Union of Scandinavia, professional groupings, and stabilizing associations of employers and employees. A significant development since 1945 has been the further strengthening of Nordic cooperation, even though the war years for a time brought occupation to 3 of the 5 Scandinavian nations. Divergent experiences in the war did not leave the bitterness which had been expected, since the nations were foresighted enough to realize that everything was to be gained by a spirit of working together in a democratic fashion. The step toward closer Scandinavian cooperation had thus not only stimulated the 5 Scandinavian countries to solve their own mutual problems, but have united them outwardly, to consolidate their strength and to use the collective Scandinavian voice to a better advantage in international questions. I believe that the most striking example of inter-Nordic cooperation to date was the formation in Copenhagen in 1953 of the Nordic Council, brilliantly conceived by the late Hans Hedtoft, Danish Prime Minister. At first composed of the 4 Scandinavian nations speaking a related tongue, the Council was joined 2 years later by the Finns. The Nordic Council is a purely consultative body set up by the legislatures of the 5 countries, consisting of 16 members from each of the parliaments of Denmark, Finland, Norway, and Sweden, and 5 from Iceland. Cabinet ministers from each nation also attend, usually about 30 in all, normally including the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister. Although cabinet ministers freely participate in the discussions of the Council and may sit in on committee meetings, they have no vote. The Nordic Council meets annually in one of the Scandinavian capitals for 1 week and deals only with, quote, current problems, that is, problems considered suitable for immediate and specific action, unquote. It should, and I quote again, abstain from making declarations, unquote, regarding purposes and objectives for which, and I quote again, no immediate measures can be proposed, unquote. The self-imposed limitations of the Council's agenda include military questions and the relations of the 5 nations with non-Scandinavian states. The reason for this limitation is clear when one ponders the fact that the Scandinavian states have not followed a common defense or foreign policy. Denmark, Iceland, and Norway are members of NATO. Sweden has sought refuge in an alliance-free neutrality, and Finland, because of her recent history involving the powerful neighbor to the east, hews to a strict neutrality policy with a special accent on her relations with the Soviet Union. Now it can be argued that since the Council precludes discussions of such important topics as foreign policy and defense, that is entirely ineffective, since these topics are fundamental to the stability of nations. I believe that this is not the case. Had the Council admitted these delicate and touchy questions to its agenda, chances are that the Council's deliberations had centered on problems impossible of solution today, and thus would have hamstrung other deliberations and may even have resulted in the Council's adjourning for good. By leaving out the burning issues of defense and foreign policy, the Council has been able to concentrate on other areas of common concern. Because the Council is only advisory, its proposals and resolutions are not binding upon the member countries. Yet there is more to the Council than its statutes suggest. It can and does present recommendations to the governments. Its recommendations, emerging as they do from discussions in which all member states have equal representation and participation, enjoy great prestige. At the session following that in which a recommendation is made, the governments are obliged to report on the action taken. Since it began to function in 1953, the Nordic Council has initiated a wide variety of policies and measures that have substantially expanded the area of collaboration among its member nations. By the end of 1961, after 8 years of activity, the Council had authored a total of 186 recommendations covering more than 250 topics. Of the total of 186, 59 had been fully accepted and 49 partly adopted by the member governments. 17 others had been adopted without government action. These recommendations ranged over a variety of subjects such as science, law, taxation, radio, television, railroad traffic and freight rates, health policy, foreign exchange, atomic energy, and Scandinavian water power problems. What has this meant in practical terms, so far as drawing the Nordic nations together? In some significant instances, the recommendations have revolutionized the old concepts of sovereignty and the privileges of nations. Passports between the Scandinavian countries were abolished early. Driver's licenses of one country are accepted in the other 4. Customs inspections of non-Scandinavians are limited to the point of entry into Scandinavia. There is virtually a common labor market. Social welfare benefits have been extended by the country of residence without reference to citizenship to all Scandinavian nationals. Here we have, in fact, an embryonic Scandinavian citizenship, which in time might help to erase national boundaries. I don't mean by what I have said above to suggest that Scandinavians have developed a utopia or a nirvana where problems have disappeared for good. Many problems do exist, but in comparison with other parts of the world, they seem minuscule and sometimes a bit trifling. And yet they occupy the separate legislative bodies in a real and earnest fashion. I am thinking of the dispute between Swedish and Norwegian shrimp fishermen in the Kattegat and the Skagerrak, or the dispute between Swedish and Finnish Lapps as to how far reindeer may graze on each other's territory in the far north, or whether Scandinavian fishermen other than Norwegians may land their catches in Norway, or whether SAS should be managed out of Stockholm or Copenhagen. Norwegians would of course want SAS headquarters in Oslo, and so it goes. The fact that the problems which confront the Scandinavians today seem insignificant to us may in reality be a confirmation of the fact that in the major areas of life they have learned the basic fact that interdependence is better than narrow nationalism. I am confident that the area of cooperative action among the Scandinavian nations is going to widen in time, and will constitute a mighty challenge to a world torn asunder by suspicion, by greed, and by insecurity. Perhaps the Scandinavian nations, small as they are individually, but collectively can show a weary world that there is no substitute for cooperation, mutual trust, and a willingness to work together in solving the dilemmas of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Olsson, for that very informative address. Now, I wonder if you'd consent to take a question or two. There's one question I would like to put to you. What was the impact of World War II on Scandinavian unity? Here you had Finland allied with Germany, you had Norway occupied, Sweden neutral, occupation experiences of Norway and Denmark somewhat different.
Well, I happen to have been living in Stockholm during 3 years of the war, so I saw at first hand some of the tensions that developed. I worked very closely with the Danish and Norwegian underground, which had offices in Stockholm. I had some very good friends on both embassies, and I must say that I was well aware that there were tensions and irritations because of certain things the Swedes were doing. There was, I think, more of an understanding for Finland's position because it was squeezed between two great powers, Germany and Russia. But I think as some of the things were made known, as for instance, the rescue of more than 3,000 Danish Jews by taking them over to Sweden and then giving them refuge there, as the war was over and some of the things came out, how Sweden had clandestinely but nevertheless helped the Norwegians, this settled down to a better understanding of what had been going on. And I think that gradually, as the mists cleared, there was definitely a feeling that the war was over, the misunderstandings were over, let's now get together and rebuild, rebuild, and I think this is what happened.
Thank you. Are there further questions? Well, this then concludes the convocation. We want to thank Dr. Olsson again because we got a great deal of benefit from his presentation. Thank you.